Elizabeth Bathory, born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, was destined for privilege. Her family controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and held influence at the royal court. She grew up surrounded by luxury, but also by brutality. From her earliest days, violence was not hidden from her. It was woven into the fabric of noble life. Hungary, in the late 16th century, was a land scarred by war, superstition, and cruelty. The Ottoman Empire pressed on its borders, peasant revolts simmered under the weight of feudal oppression, and nobles enforced their authority with the sword. Executions, whippings, and public torture were not exceptional spectacles. They were routine demonstrations of power, and young Elizabeth was watching. From the start, Elizabeth's upbringing shaped her into something far darker than an ordinary aristocrat. Family stories claim she witnessed executions and punishments as a child, sometimes even observing as servants were whipped bloody for minor mistakes. In some accounts, she delighted in the sight, a chilling foreshadow of what was to come. Some historians believe Elizabeth also suffered from epileptic seizures in childhood, perhaps due to inbreeding in her powerful family line. Remedies of the day included rubbing animal blood onto her lips, or even bathing in it to stop convulsions. If true, this could have planted the seed for her later obsession with blood. At 15, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a powerful Hungarian warlord. Their marriage united two of the wealthiest families in Hungary, cementing Elizabeth's position as one of the most powerful women in Europe. Ferenc was often away at war, leaving Elizabeth in charge of their vast estate, Chaktic Castle. As the lady of the castle, she wielded absolute authority over hundreds of peasants and servants. To defy her was unthinkable. Elizabeth was not merely a noblewoman, she was a ruler in her own right. And with this power came opportunity, the ability to do as she pleased behind castle walls, free from scrutiny, protected by her name. It was here that Elizabeth's cruelty began to take its most terrifying form. While other nobles might beat or whip disobedient servants, Elizabeth allegedly escalated punishments into sadistic rituals. Servants whispered that she enjoyed inflicting pain, that she found pleasure in watching others suffer. When her husband was home, he may have encouraged this streak. Ferenc was known as the Black Hero of Hungary, a man who delighted in brutality against the Ottomans. Some legends claim he even taught Elizabeth new methods of torment. By the time he died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth widowed and in full control of her estates, her sadism was no longer a rumour. It had become routine. Bathory's position gave her unparalleled power to prey upon those beneath her. Peasant families often sent their daughters to noble houses to work as servants, seamstresses, or attendants. It was considered an honour, a chance for a girl to gain security and even protection. But those who entered Chaktic Castle under Elizabeth's watch often vanished. The whispers grew louder. The lady of the castle was not merely strict, she was cruel beyond comprehension. Witnesses would later testify that Elizabeth began with small acts of violence, slaps, pinches, or forcing servants to strip naked in the cold. But soon these escalated into savage beatings, mutilations, and worse. The cruelty was not a loss of temper, it was calculated. Elizabeth Bathory, it seemed, did not just punish, she enjoyed it. What made Elizabeth so dangerous was not only her sadism, but her immunity. As a noblewoman, she was untouchable. Peasants who whispered of her crimes could be punished themselves for slander. Families whose daughters disappeared dared not accuse her directly. They knew it would mean ruin or death. Protected by her wealth, her title, and her vast estate, Elizabeth Bathory's crimes festered in secrecy. Behind the thick walls of Chaktic Castle, far from the eyes of law and king, she built a private world where her word was law and human lives were toys to be broken. And this was only the beginning. For in the years that followed, Elizabeth Bathory would become something more than a cruel noblewoman. She would become a legend of horror, accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women, bathing in their blood, and earning the title of the Blood Countess. Whether all of the tales are true or not, one thing is certain. Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror began not with bloodbaths, but with the slow, steady corruption of unchecked power. A house of horror, the castle as a prison. If Elizabeth Bathory's sadism was born of privilege, it was Choctaw Castle that allowed it to thrive. Perched high on a hill in present-day Slovakia, this fortress became more than a noble estate. It became a chamber of horrors, a labyrinth where young women vanished, never to be seen alive again. Choctaw Castle was both imposing and isolated. Its high stone walls and commanding view of the surrounding countryside made it nearly impossible for anyone inside to escape unnoticed. For the peasants who lived nearby, the castle loomed as a symbol of power, authority, and increasingly, dread. To outsiders, it was a respectable, noble residence. To those who served within, it was a cage. Elizabeth ruled it with absolute authority, aided by a retinue of loyal servants who enforced her will. And as whispers of her cruelty spread, Choctaw gained a darker reputation. It was a place where young girls entered but never returned. Elizabeth's victims were not kidnapped in the dead of night. Many came willingly, even eagerly. Poor families often sent their daughters to noble households for work, hoping they might find stability or advancement. Elizabeth's noble status made her an attractive patron. To be chosen to serve the Countess was considered an honor, but for many it was a death sentence. Witnesses later described how Elizabeth would summon groups of young women to the castle under the guise of employment, seamstresses, maids, or attendants, only for them to disappear within weeks. Parents who inquired were brushed off with excuses. The girl had run away, fallen ill, or been dismissed. Few dared press further, for to accuse a Bathory was to invite ruin. Inside the castle, certain chambers became infamous. Some testimonies spoke of hidden rooms and dungeons where the Countess carried out her torments. Windows were shuttered, walls thickened, and screams that might have escaped into the night were muffled by stone. Peasants claimed to see smoke rise at odd hours, or to hear faint cries carried by the wind. Servants whispered of secret cellars where bodies were disposed of, or shallow graves dug hurriedly near the castle grounds. Elizabeth did not act alone. Her accomplices, trusted servants such as Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, and Janos Ujivari, allegedly helped restrain victims, clean up after the tortures, and dispose of corpses. Together, they transformed Choctaw into a machine of cruelty. For the girls who lived there, daily life must have been a waking nightmare. They never knew when Elizabeth's temper would flare, when she might decide to punish one of them for a mistake, real or imagined. A misfolded garment, a poorly brushed lock of hair, or a word spoken too softly could bring her wrath. Witnesses described how punishments began as beatings but escalated into mutilation. Some were locked in freezing chambers, stripped naked in the snow, or burned with irons. Others were starved, pricked with needles, or beaten until their flesh split open. Every corner of the castle held terror. The kitchens, where boiling water or hot oil could become weapons. The bedrooms, where Elizabeth might summon a girl under pretense of service only to torment her. The cellars, where screams echoed in darkness. As years passed, the number of victims grew impossible to ignore. Rumours spread in nearby villages of shallow graves found near the castle, of carts carrying bodies under cover of night. Some said wolves dragged bones into the open fields. Priests began to whisper that something unnatural was happening at Choctaw, and yet Elizabeth's nobility shielded her. Who could accuse one of the most powerful women in Hungary without risking their own life? The bodies, however, could not be hidden forever. Servants testified that sometimes corpses were left lying in halls or stairways, too numerous to dispose of quickly. Even Elizabeth herself grew careless, so accustomed was she to impunity. Choctaw Castle was more than the scene of Elizabeth's crimes. It was the enabler. Its walls gave her privacy. Its servants enforced her will, and its isolation silenced the screams of the dying. For the villagers below, the castle became less a fortress of protection than a looming prison. They prayed their daughters would not be summoned, that their families would escape the Countess's gaze. But in a world where nobles ruled with absolute authority, few had any power to resist. Over time, Choctaw gained a reputation not only as the dwelling of a cruel noblewoman, but as a house of horror, a cursed place where evil lingered. Later, legends embellished the story, secret torture chambers bristling with devices, walls that absorbed the blood of victims, ghosts of murdered girls wandering the halls. While some of these details blur fact with folklore, one truth is undeniable. The castle was the perfect setting for Elizabeth's crimes. Its very stones seemed to conspire with her, hiding her atrocities until they grew too vast to conceal. Rituals of pain, methods of torture and murder. If Choctaw Castle was the stage, then Elizabeth Bathory's sadism was the performance, a ritual of pain repeated again and again, with young women as unwilling participants. What set Elizabeth apart from ordinary cruelty was not only the scale of her violence, but the creativity of it. Witnesses later testified to methods of torture so varied and shocking that they blurred the line between punishment and ritualistic obsession. Many testimonies began with the same detail, the beatings. Elizabeth was said to fly into fits of rage at the smallest mistake, a dress not sewn tightly enough, a towel left unfolded, a curl of hair out of place. She would strike the servant mercilessly, using her fists, whips, or heavy wooden clubs. But these were not ordinary punishments. Witnesses described beatings so savage that flesh split open, bones broke, and blood spattered the walls. Some girls were beaten to death in a single night, their bodies dragged away before dawn. Others lingered, crippled and scarred, until the Countess decided to end their suffering. Elizabeth's cruelty extended far beyond blows. Servants testified that she often used fire as a weapon. Girls were burned with red-hot irons pressed against their skin, branding them like cattle. Some were forced to hold burning candles until the wax melted into their flesh. Others were doused with boiling water or oil, their screams echoing through the stone chambers. On winter nights, some were stripped naked and forced into the snow, doused with water until they froze. Villagers claimed to find bodies stiff and pale near the castle grounds, their faces twisted in agony. Blades were another of Elizabeth's tools. Some victims were slashed repeatedly, left to bleed slowly. Others had their lips, noses, or fingers cut off. One account tells of girls forced to eat pieces of their own flesh torn from their bodies. The Countess was said to take particular pleasure in tormenting hands and faces, slapping, pricking with needles, or slicing with scissors. These acts carried a cruel symbolism: the hands that had failed in service, the faces that had dared to look at her. Elizabeth's cruelty was not always immediate. Some victims were locked in chambers and deliberately starved. Testimonies tell of girls reduced to skin and bone, crawling on the floor for scraps. Others were deprived of sleep, water, or warmth until their bodies gave out. In some accounts, she mocked their suffering, taunting them with food or promising release only to prolong their torment. For Elizabeth, suffering itself was the entertainment. The methods were not random, they had a ritualistic quality. Witnesses spoke of Elizabeth changing clothes before punishments, preparing instruments as though performing a ceremony. She did not merely lash out in anger, she orchestrated the violence, savoring every step. This ritualistic cruelty fed later legends that she practiced witchcraft or satanic rites, though evidence for this is scarce. What is clear, however, is that Elizabeth's tortures followed a pattern, a calculated escalation from pain to death, repeated again and again, like a grim performance. Some historians have speculated about a sexual element in her crimes. Witnesses often described the Countess touching, handling, or restraining her victims in ways that suggested more than simple punishment. Whether this was true or the invention of scandalized chroniclers is debated, but it is undeniable that Elizabeth's violence carried an intimate, personal quality. She wanted to see, hear, and feel her victims' suffering. For many victims, torture ended in death. Some were strangled, others stabbed, and many simply beaten until life left their bodies. Their corpses were disposed of in secret, sometimes buried in castle grounds, other times hidden in forests. As the years went on, the number of bodies grew impossible to conceal. Some witnesses later estimated the death toll at hundreds, with numbers ranging from 80 to 600. Even if the lowest estimates are true, Elizabeth Bathory ranks among the most prolific killers in history. Elizabeth did not act alone. Her accomplices, trusted servants and retainers, were essential to her crimes. They restrained victims, cleaned blood from the floors, disposed of corpses, and lured new girls to the castle. Some did so out of fear, others perhaps shared in her cruelty. When the crimes finally came to light, these accomplices became key witnesses, their testimonies painting the picture of Elizabeth's reign of terror. What made these tortures even more terrifying was the atmosphere they created. Every servant in Chactich lived in fear, knowing they could be the next victim. Terror itself became a tool of control. Elizabeth did not need armies or laws to enforce obedience. The screams echoing from her chambers were enough. Blood obsession, myth or reality? Of all the tales surrounding Elizabeth Bathory, none has seized the imagination quite like the image of her bathing in the blood of virgins. It is this detail that earned her the title of the Blood Countess, and later inspired the myth of vampirism that echoes through Gothic horror to this day. But was it true? Or was it the ultimate exaggeration of an already terrifying reputation? The earliest accounts of Elizabeth's crimes, taken from the testimonies of her servants and neighbours, make no mention of ritual blood bathing. They speak of beatings, torture, starvation, and murder, but not of baths filled with crimson. The blood legend first appeared decades later in sensational retellings of her case. According to these stories, Elizabeth once struck a servant girl so hard that blood spattered onto her hand. When she wiped it away, she thought her skin looked smoother, more youthful. From then on, she allegedly became obsessed with the idea that bathing in virgin blood would preserve her beauty. It is a chilling story, but its absence from contemporary records raises suspicion. Did Elizabeth truly believe blood could grant eternal youth? Or was this a legend invented by later chroniclers to amplify her monstrosity? To understand why this legend endured, we must consider Elizabeth's world. In the 16th and 17th centuries, women, especially noble women, were judged heavily by their beauty and fertility. Aging was feared not just as a loss of youth, but as a loss of power. Elizabeth, once famed for her striking appearance, may have become increasingly paranoid about her looks as she aged. Even if she never literally bathed in blood, her obsession with youth and dominance could have inspired stories that exaggerated her cruelty into the realm of the supernatural. The very image of bathing in blood has a powerful symbolic resonance. Blood has always been associated with vitality, strength, and life itself. To imagine someone immersing themselves in it is to imagine a person consuming the very essence of others to prolong their own existence. In a world where accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, and devil worship abounded, Elizabeth's cruelty made her an easy target for this type of legend. The story fit perfectly into the narrative of a noble woman turned monster, a woman who had crossed into the unnatural, trading humanity for vanity. Crucially, the testimonies recorded at Elizabeth's eventual trial do not describe blood bathing. Servants testified to torture methods, mutilations, and deaths, but none described their mistress filling a tub with gore. This silence suggests the bloodbath tale may have been a later embellishment, a way to make her crimes sound more shocking to a public eager for horror. Yet, some accounts do speak of her fascination with the blood of her victims. Witnesses claimed she smeared blood on her hands, rubbed it on her face, or licked it from wounds. These details, while horrifying, are plausible extensions of her sadism, acts of domination and degradation, rather than mystical beauty rituals. So, was Elizabeth Bathory truly obsessed with blood? The answer lies somewhere between fact and myth. While she may not have bathed in barrels of blood, it is likely she experimented with it in smaller, grotesque ways, smearing it, tasting it, reveling in it. But the full legend of bloodbaths was almost certainly a product of imagination, spun by chroniclers who sought to immortalize her as a vampiric figure. Over time, fact and fiction fused, and Elizabeth became less a historical woman and more a Gothic archetype, the beautiful, bloodthirsty predator. It is no coincidence that Elizabeth Bathory's story later influenced Gothic literature and vampire myths. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries drew upon her legend when crafting tales of female vampires who preyed on the young to preserve their own vitality. Some scholars even argue that Bathory was a direct inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Though Stoker based his vampire largely on Vlad the Impaler, the image of Elizabeth, a noble figure drinking the blood of innocence for immortality, certainly echoes through the novel's shadowy pages. In this way, Elizabeth Bathory transcended history to become myth, her cruelty exaggerated into a supernatural horror that continues to fascinate audiences today. Even if the bloodbath stories were false, they captured something essential about Elizabeth's crimes, the sense that her victims were not merely punished, but consumed. Their lives, their pain, and even their bodies became fuel for her power. Blood was the perfect symbol for this. It was not just the fluid of life, it was a metaphor for how Elizabeth fed on the youth and vitality of others to maintain her own dominance.
The cover-up, how nobility protected her. The story of Elizabeth Bathory is not only about cruelty, it is about impunity. For years, perhaps decades, she allegedly tortured and murdered young women. Hundreds of victims vanished behind the walls of Choctych Castle. Yet, despite rumours, despite mounting evidence, Elizabeth Bathory lived untouched, shielded by her title, her family name, and a network of nobles who preferred silence to scandal. In 16th and 17th century Hungary, noble status was more than privilege. It was armour. The aristocracy were not judged by the same laws as peasants. A noblewoman of Elizabeth's rank, tied by blood to the most powerful families in the kingdom, was virtually untouchable. The Bathorys were among the elite of Europe. Elizabeth's relatives included kings of Poland, a prince of Transylvania, and members of the Habsburg royal circle. To accuse her of crimes was not simply to accuse a woman, it was to accuse an entire dynasty. Few dared take such a risk, and yet whispers spread. Villagers spoke of daughters who entered the castle but never returned. Priests noticed an alarming number of sudden deaths among young women connected to Elizabeth's household. Some families did dare to complain. A priest once confronted Elizabeth after seeing bruises on a servant's body during burial. He warned her that God's judgment awaited. Elizabeth, unshaken, replied coldly, "And you, Reverend, may answer to me." Such arrogance showed how secure she felt in her power. The peasants were trapped in a terrible bind. To accuse Elizabeth was to risk reprisal. To remain silent was to watch their daughters vanish. For years, silence won. What makes the cover-up even darker is that Elizabeth did not prey only on peasants. Eventually, she lured young noblewomen into her orbit as well. Some aristocratic families sent their daughters to Elizabeth for finishing school, believing service under a powerful countess would improve their prospects for marriage. When these girls too began to disappear, the whispers turned to alarm. Elizabeth had crossed a line. Nobles who had tolerated peasant deaths as the cost of silence could no longer ignore her. The Catholic Church, powerful in Hungary, was not blind to Elizabeth's crimes. Priests buried far too many suspicious bodies from her household. Some gave warnings, some filed quiet reports, but most hesitated. Elizabeth's family connections and donations to the church made her dangerous to confront. Clergy may also have feared public scandal. To expose one of the most powerful noblewomen in Christendom as a sadist and mass murderer would have shaken the faith of peasants already plagued by war, famine, and superstition. And so the silence stretched on. The broader political climate also played into Elizabeth's impunity. Hungary at the time was a fractured land, caught between the Habsburg monarchy and the encroaching Ottoman Empire. The nobility were essential to maintaining stability. To accuse Elizabeth was to risk destabilizing alliances, weakening aristocratic unity, and undermining confidence in noble rule. The crown, wary of upsetting powerful families, chose caution over justice. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes became a known secret. whispered of, but never acted upon. What finally changed? Some historians believe it was the sheer number of victims. Bodies could only be buried in secret for so long before the stench of truth grew too strong. Others argue it was when Elizabeth began targeting noble daughters that her protection crumbled. By 1609, too many families had lost too many daughters. Pressure mounted not from peasants, but from nobles themselves. The Habsburg King Matthias II could no longer ignore the scandal. He commissioned Count György Thurzo, a trusted noble, to investigate. Thurzo was no peasant farmer afraid of reprisal. He was a seasoned statesman, loyal to the crown and, critically, related by marriage to the Bathorys. This connection gave him both authority and caution. He could not allow Elizabeth's crimes to remain unpunished, but neither could he risk dragging the entire Bathory name into ruin. His investigation revealed what many already suspected. Girls had vanished by the dozens, bodies buried in shallow graves, servants willing to testify to horrors beyond imagination. Yet even then, Thurzo tread carefully. His orders were not to destroy Elizabeth, but to contain her scandal. The trial of shadows, witnesses, and evidence. By 1610, Elizabeth Bathory's legend was no longer whispered behind closed doors. It thundered in the halls of the Hungarian court. For decades, rumours had circulated of missing girls, of bodies pulled from the earth, of screams echoing through Choctich Castle. But it was not until noble daughters began to vanish that King Matthias II could no longer look away. The cover-up had run its course. Now came the investigation, the arrests, and the trial. But justice, when it came, would be cloaked in politics, secrecy, and shadows. On a bitter night in December 1610, Count György Thurzo led a small force of men to Choctich Castle. Their mission: confront the Countess and put an end to the scandal. What they found inside was the stuff of nightmares. Accounts differ, but some claim that Thurzo and his men discovered Elizabeth in the act of tormenting a girl, with other victims' bodies strewn about the chambers. Others describe half-dead young women found imprisoned in cells, their bodies mutilated, their eyes hollow with terror. Though sensational, these accounts may have been exaggerated to justify her arrest. What is certain is that the investigators found enough evidence, both living and dead, to confirm the rumours that had haunted the countryside for years. Elizabeth was not dragged to prison in chains. She was placed under house arrest in her castle, shielded even in disgrace by her noble status. Her accomplices, however, were not so fortunate. Elizabeth's servants, Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Janos Ujvari, and Katerina Benica, were quickly arrested and interrogated. Under torture themselves, they confessed in grisly detail to the crimes of their mistress. They described how Elizabeth beat, burned, and mutilated her victims, sometimes with her own hands, sometimes directing the servants to do so. They spoke of corpses hidden in cellars, buried in orchards, or burned to ash. The number of victims stunned the investigators. Some confessions suggested as many as 600 dead girls. Others gave lower but still staggering numbers: dozens, scores, perhaps hundreds. Of course, torture extracted these testimonies, and modern historians debate their reliability. But taken together with the physical evidence of bodies and the testimony of surviving servants, the portrait was damning. Beyond her accomplices, other witnesses also came forward. Local peasants described sending daughters to the castle who never returned. Priests testified to suspicious burials. Survivors, rare but not impossible, told of beatings and starvation. The evidence built a picture of systematic cruelty, orchestrated not in a fit of madness, but as a pattern of behaviour that lasted years. And yet, for all the evidence, Elizabeth Bathory herself never set foot in a courtroom. Why? Because Elizabeth was still a Bathory. To put her on trial publicly would have meant scandal on a scale Hungary could not endure. To expose her crimes openly would not only disgrace one of the kingdom's greatest families, but also risk shaking the very faith of the people in their rulers. Instead, her servants were tried and executed in January 1611. Some were burned alive, others beheaded. their bodies destroyed as punishment for their complicity. Their confessions, extracted under duress, became the official narrative of Elizabeth's crimes. Elizabeth herself was declared guilty but spared the public spectacle. Instead, she was sentenced to permanent house arrest. Walls were built to confine her in a set of rooms within her own castle, windows bricked up, her only contact with the outside world through small openings where food was passed. It was a punishment designed not for justice, but for containment. Elizabeth Bathory was too powerful to execute, too notorious to free. She would be buried alive in her own fortress, hidden from the world she had terrorized. The trial was not justice, it was damage control. By sparing Elizabeth the courtroom, the Crown avoided dragging the Bathory name through public humiliation. By executing her servants, the authorities created scapegoats, shifting some of the blame away from their mistress. Even the number of victims was quietly suppressed. Official records mentioned 80 confirmed cases, horrifying enough, but far less than the hundreds whispered by rumor. It was a compromise between truth and stability, designed to preserve Hungary's fragile social order. For the next 4 years, Elizabeth lived entombed in her castle. Servants passed food through narrow slits, but no one saw her face again. In 1614, she was found dead in her chamber, aged only 54, but broken by isolation. Her body was buried, but even in death she was denied peace. Locals demanded her remains be removed from the castle cemetery, fearing her ghost would haunt them. Eventually, she was interred in the Bathory family crypt, though the exact location remains uncertain, perhaps lost, perhaps hidden, as if history itself wished to erase her. The so-called trial of Elizabeth Bathory reveals as much about her world as it does about her crimes. It shows a society where justice bent to power, where noble blood could shield even the most monstrous deeds. It was not a fair reckoning, but a shadow play, designed to satisfy outrage without shaking the pillars of aristocracy. Elizabeth Bathory was punished, yes, but not in a way that matched the scale of her crimes. She was neither exonerated nor fully condemned, but trapped in limbo, guilty enough to silence, noble enough to protect. The legacy of the Blood Countess, myth, fear, and Gothic legend. Elizabeth Bathory's death in 1614 did not end her story. In some ways, it was only the beginning. The woman who had once ruled Chactich Castle with fear and impunity soon transformed into a legend that spread across Europe and beyond, a symbol of noble corruption, feminine monstrosity, and supernatural evil. Her crimes lived on, whispered in villages, chronicled by historians, and eventually immortalized in folklore, literature, and horror. In the years after her death, Elizabeth became more than a disgraced noblewoman. She became the Blood Countess. The rumors of her bathing in blood, her obsession with eternal youth, and her sadistic rituals were exaggerated and repeated until they eclipsed the facts of her trial. The image of Elizabeth as a woman who murdered not just for cruelty, but for vanity, seeking beauty through the blood of virgins, proved irresistible. It transformed her from a murderer into a monster, a cautionary tale of female vanity and unrestrained power. Part of Elizabeth's enduring legacy stems from how she embodied fears about powerful women. In a patriarchal society, female rulers were often mistrusted, depicted as unnatural or dangerous. Elizabeth's crimes, whether fully true, exaggerated, or fabricated, fed perfectly into this narrative. She became the archetype of the female tyrant, a noblewoman who twisted her authority into cruelty. To some, she was a warning against women wielding power. To others, she was proof that corruption lurked behind aristocratic privilege. One of the enduring controversies around Elizabeth Bathory is the number of her victims. Official trial records confirm around 80 cases, but testimony under torture suggested as many as 600. Historians debate whether these numbers were inflated, exaggerated for political reasons, or accurate reflections of her crimes. Regardless of the truth, the sheer scale of the accusation cemented her legacy. Even the lowest numbers placed her among the most prolific killers in history. The highest numbers made her practically mythical, a butcher whose cruelty rivaled wars. As stories of Elizabeth Bathory spread, they increasingly took on a vampiric tone. The blood-bathing legend, whether factual or fabricated, aligned perfectly with Europe's growing fascination with tales of blood drinkers and immortality. By the 18th century, pamphlets and histories depicted her as a proto-vampire. In the 19th, Gothic literature fully absorbed her into the canon of bloodthirsty figures. She became an inspiration for characters in plays, novels, and eventually films. Some scholars argue that without Bathory, the archetype of the seductive, immortal female vampire might never have taken such strong root in European storytelling. In the villages surrounding Choctaw Castle, Elizabeth's name lingered as a ghost story. Locals whispered that her spirit haunted the ruins, that cries of murdered girls could still be heard on stormy nights, that the soil itself was cursed by blood. Her castle became a place of dread. Travelers avoided its shadow. Generations of peasants grew up fearing the legend of the Countess, warning their daughters never to stray too close to her domain. Modern historians have also questioned how much of Bathory's story is fact and how much was shaped by politics. Some argue she was indeed guilty of terrible cruelty, though perhaps not on the scale legend suggests. Others suggest she was framed, her crimes exaggerated by male nobles eager to seize her estates after her husband's death. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Elizabeth likely committed many acts of cruelty, enough to shock even her contemporaries, but her myth grew because it served the purposes of others. By painting her as a monster, the crown and nobility could confiscate her lands while satisfying public outrage. Today, Elizabeth Bathory endures not as a historical figure alone, but as a cultural icon of horror. She has appeared in novels, films, video games, and heavy metal songs. Her story has been reimagined countless times, sometimes as a vain noblewoman, sometimes as a supernatural vampire, sometimes even as a misunderstood victim of political intrigue. From Hammer horror films to American Horror Story, Bathory's shadow continues to loom. She is remembered less as a 17th century Hungarian countess than as a Gothic archetype, the woman who lived and killed for blood. But beneath the layers of legend lies the real horror, not the myth of bloodbaths, but the reality of power unchecked. Elizabeth Bathory's story, stripped of embellishment, is about a noblewoman who could exploit, torture, and kill because society allowed her to.